While I did think that 2.6 would be arriving soon, which would allow me to talk about Iuno and Augusta, it turns out that besides one short story quest this update, there really isn't actually much in the way of the remaining 10 or so days of 2.5, so what that of course leaves us with is some time to do probably just one more, and I know I do say this quite often, one more resonator before 2.6. And when I was thinking about which, I decided that it would be interesting to have a shot at analyzing a character from before Renacita, with the character that really, I think, heralded that Wuthering Waves as a game was breaking out of the honestly awful storytelling of Chapter 1 to a lot more of kind of a higher quality storytelling that we recognize today. And the resonator that really brought out the fore of the disaster that was Chapter 1 was Jinhsi, with her story quest, The Four of Eons. Like Cardafia, Jinhsi is one of the few characters that I have C6'd, mostly because I got exceptionally lucky this time around, not really because of any actually real saving that I did. And as we step away from Renacita, we're going to also be going away from the realm of Western symbolism that I've been going over extensively in my previous videos. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll be putting up a glossary on the next page, but as always, make sure you're aware, spoilers are ahead. I think the very first thing we need to cover before we actually go through anything else is what Jinhsi's name actually means. Jinhsi is a bit of a complex name to decipher because it's shortened Chinese compound word in a sense. The first part of her name, Jin, translates into a sort of short prefix that means the present or the current. For instance, in Chinese, the word 今天 means today. Jin meaning the present or the current, and Tian meaning day. So that's the first part. The second word, Si, which for you Latin speakers is actually romanized in pinyin as xi, but is spoken as Si, with a sort of hissing sound, is a word that basically means tide, as in the tide of water. So sort of related to the whole concept of wuthering waves basically, but we'll get to that later. Because when you put the two words of Jinhsi's name together, the English translation essentially means present tide. There's a lot of symbolic significance for this that we will be linking towards later, so I do need you to hold on for a second. But what I can spoil a little bit for now is that Jinhsi's name essentially presents her as a sort of constant bastion against the wuthering waves, or the waves of the lament. If you remember Jinhsi's story, she has an immense duty in safeguarding Jingzhe against the onslaught of the dark tide. The idea of the present tide is a sort of metaphor for Jinhsi's preservation and defense against present and current problems. But there are also some other aspects of symbolism that will fall into this later, such as Li Bai's poetry and the concept of the flowing river of time. However, before we cover that, we first need to go through some other things first. With Sentinel Jue being such an integral part of Jinhsi's 1.1 story quest, I think it is fitting to first talk about dragons before anything else. As you may know, dragons in Chinese culture and folklore are very different from Western dragons, looking more akin to flying serpents and representing wisdom, strength, and prosperity. Chief among these are the Dragon Kings, or Longuang, which govern bodies of water, such as rivers or seas. And as you can see, we're already beginning to weave Jinhsi's name and the present tide into all of this. These Longuang, or Dragon Kings, were seen in Chinese culture as celestial beings, similar to Jue itself. The Mianlong chamber, which it inhabits during the quest, is also a reference to Dragon Kings residing in and governing bodies of water. And that is quite relevant to another point with Dragon Kings. Since Dragon Kings control bodies of water, People in ancient China, especially during times of drought or flood, oftentimes prayed and underwent rituals to invoke rain or stop floods of water, basically calling upon dragon kings to help them. For instance, some rituals called for throwing a tiger bone into a cave that a dragon would be living in, and as tigers and dragons were opposites and enemies through yin and yang, this would, for instance, result in a dragon to fight, and the fight would call down the rain. However, dragon kings didn't have infinite power, especially during winter. Dragon kings often had to return to their caves to replenish their energy, otherwise they basically wouldn't be able to use their waterbending powers, essentially. That actually sounds so wrong, sorry. My god. Okay, anyway, when we look at the story of Zhang, we see that as a sentinel, he serves rovers orders to protect Jingzhe and Hongzhen. Just like how dragon kings in Chinese culture were oftentimes called down to avert disasters, such as droughts and floods, Zhang serves as the sentinel of the area, erecting the temporal barrier to stop the offensive of tacit discords. The temporal barrier itself functions with Zhang freezing time in order to prevent enemies attacking, which parallels Jinhsi's name, the present tide, with Zhang essentially making an eternal present that is safe from the elements. Similar to how dragon kings often had to return to their water caves or underwater caves to restore their powers, Zhang also continues to protect Jingzhe and Hongzhen, oftentimes having to go back into the water cave of the Mianlong chamber to sustain itself. As a result of this, just like how dragons were worshipped in ancient times, due to their believed role in averting crises and disasters, the people of Hongzhen and Jingzhe similarly also revered their sentinel for protecting them against the elements, hence their devotion in even carving a mountain, the Lung's crest, in the shape of Zhang. One of the more obvious symbolic references in Jinhsi's story doesn't actually come from her itself necessarily, but from the nation of Huanglong. Aside from being the introductory and first nation in the game, Huanglong means yellow dragon in Chinese. This is a direct reference to the Yellow Emperor, otherwise known as Huangdi, who is one of the most famous emperors in Chinese history. Known by his other name, the Yellow Dragon, because he is believed to have descended from the most powerful of the 5 Chinese dragon kings, Huangdi has an almost religious level of fame, being oftentimes seen as China's first real emperor, and oftentimes also as the starting point of Chinese history in, for example, the works of Sima Qian. Though his portrayal and even existence in history has been hotly debated in recent times, it's not an exaggeration to say that he still has an immense influence in Chinese culture. For the more Western side of my audience, for example, an easy way to quickly kind of understand this concept is that Huangdi almost has a similar divine nature, similar to that of, let's just say, an Abrahamic prophet like Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad. A lot of stories of his birth, for example, relate to the idea that he was born with dragon-like features, or was part dragon himself, with many legends basically pushing him as an incarnation of the yellow dragon. Even today, for instance, a lot of Han Chinese people often consider themselves to be descended from dragons, because they trace their lineage back to Huangdi. That's why if you look at something like the Qing dynasty's flag, it has a yellow dragon on it, because it's basically a national symbol at this point. And if you think about it, this parallels quite a bit with Jinhsi's sort of rebirth and her resonance abilities, which makes her seem part dragon. What's most important, however, is the fact that, just like Huangdi, she is divinely chosen, or essentially the resonator of a dragon, of the sentinel. Similar to how the yellow dragon is the centerpiece and the most powerful of the 5 dragon kings, Jinhsi serves as basically the linchpin of Jingzhe, which in itself is referred to as the throat of Huanglong. Just as how Huangdi's legend has him leading his people to prosperity through his guidance, Jinhsi also guides her people through the present calamities of the laments, battling against every wave that hits the shores of her home, in the hopes of building a better future. Perhaps one of the more well-known aspects of Chinese symbolism, even in the West, is the concept of Tianming, or otherwise known as the Mandate of Heaven. It's actually really similar to the Divine Right of Kings that you have in the West, and just like the Divine Right of Kings, it was essentially used to justify the legitimacy of a seemingly illegitimate dynasty. In this case, it would have been the Zhou over the Shang dynasty, but in the West, it would have been that of the Tudor dynasty after the War of the Roses. In essence, it's this idea that a Chinese ruler was divinely chosen to rule, and similar to Western versions, basically posited that they were a sort of son of heaven, or a representative of God or the divine. It was thought that if an emperor or king in China was affected by terrible fortune or was overthrown, then that was basically heaven's way of showing their displeasure and at their immorality or incompetence, basically having lost the mandate of heaven. It could also be used to basically justify rebellion and revolution over an emperor, basically completing what we in China call a dynastic cycle, as new emperors would claim the mandate of heaven over old and crumbling dynasties. What Tianming essentially encapsulates in the end really is the fundamentals of meritocracy, that a leader needs to be astute, moral, and most importantly competent, otherwise they would lose their divine graces and essentially lose their right to rule. And this is something that perfectly compounds on what we've already talked about and ties in with Jinhsi's story. Because not only is Jinhsi in herself divinely ordained with powers from the god figure of Jingzhe, or essentially Sentinel Jue, but there is actually a sort of Tianming or heavenly mandate actually directly in her story and in the game. If you recall, Jue has a power to control time, which is how they actually protect the whole region. As Jue is dying, Jue basically plans to freeze time for one final time to protect Jingzhe and Hongzhen, which is a whole central problem of the story arc and why Jinhsi needs to fight Jue to trigger a second awakening. What's important about this, however, is that this power to control time that Jue, the divine being of the area, wields, is called the Temporal Mandates. Aside from the fact that there are obvious naming parallels between the Temporal Mandate and the Heavenly Mandate, the symbolic value of both are also really similar. While the Tianming is a sort of heaven-ordained right for a ruler to rule, being seen as a measure of their competence and ability, the Temporal Mandate is the ability and method in which Jingzhe is protected from the laments. Similar to how the Heavenly Mandate comes with the immense responsibility of leading one's nation with competence and acumen, Jinhsi's duty as magistrate effectively mirrors the weight that Tianming places on her shoulders. What is most important, however, is that the entire focus of Jinhsi's story quest is passing on Jue's temporal mandate to her through a second awakening quest, which is something that comes with immense difficulty and strain. However, once attained, Jinhsi's new temporal mandate is essentially in nearly every way a parallel of the mandate of heaven. It is what allows her to protect Jingzhe and be a competent leader, and it is also an ordained connection that she has with the divinity that justifies her rule.
The transfer has been carried out as you instructed. Jinhsi, one shall honor one's promise and restore Jingzhe's future to you and its people.
I actually found a symbolic reference on Reddit from a user called Final Evening 9606, where near the end of Changli's story quest, you will see her speaking to a younger Jinhsi with a very famous specific 4 lines that comes from the Song dynasty philosopher Zhang or Hengqui. They are as follows: 非天地理行, to ordain conscience for heaven and earth. Second, 为生命立命, to secure the life and prosperity of the people. Third, 为望生日哲学, to continue the teachings of past sages. And fourth, 为王世开太平, to establish peace for future generations. When you put everything we've already covered about Jinhsi's responsibilities and divinity, each of these 4 points actually makes an enormous amount of sense. As a divine representative of Zhue, being connected both through her rebirth and temporal mandate as Zhue's chosen resonator, Jinhsi fulfills the first statement, to ordain conscience for heaven and earth, bridging the gap between humanity and divinity. Further, Jinhsi's responsibility as magistrate nearly just entirely reflects the second statement, to secure the life and prosperity of the people. Just as how she is linked to divinity through Tianming, she is also committed to prosperity and safety of the people of Hongzhen and Jingzhe. As a present tide in the element, she will use a temporal mandate to carve a safe shore against its endless waves. The third statement, to continue the teachings of past sages, is an interesting one. As we already talked about before in the section of Huanglong and how it relates to Huangdi, we've already discussed that the Yellow Emperor takes on an almost divine status in Chinese culture. And when I heard Changli say this line, I was immediately taken back to a quote from Confucius, who stated that Huangdi is said to have lived for 300 years. In this he says, "When the Yellow Emperor was alive, people benefited from his rule for 100 years. After he died, people stood in awe of his spirit for 100 years. After his spirit had disappeared, people used his teachings for 100 years. For this reason, people say that the Yellow Emperor lived for 300 years." And essentially from this quote, we can see that in Chinese culture there's a really strong ethos of preserving the lessons of our ancestors, to stay true to tradition, essentially. And beside the parallel of Huangdi, which we already discussed, there is a sense that Jinhsi evokes the teachings of her mentor, Changli, as well as her sentinel, Zhue, having all been imparted in her, which leads to the fourth point, to establish peace for future generations. Just as how she carves a haven to safeguard the present tide, she also takes on responsibility for the future. In taking on Jingzhe into her name, Jinhsi forges a pact to essentially guarantee peace, not only for today, but for tomorrow.
Tread with caution and join our sacred duty to defend the city and its folk with honor and fervency. The rite has concluded. From this moment on, you will be Jingzhe, the new magistrate of Jingzhe.
One of the lesser-known aspects of Jinhsi's 1.1 story quest, the Four of Eons, is that the name of the quest in English is actually a major simplification of what it actually means in Chinese, which is Wang Sui, Sheng Shao, Xing Jingzhe. Roughly translating, and it is pretty rough, it means past years ride the clouds to awaken the Jingzhe. This is of course a direct reference to Jingzhe, which in Chinese means the awakening of insects. Jingzhe is the third of China's 24 solar terms, and it's a time between the end of winter and the beginning of spring, when thunder will awaken the sleeping insects. Usually, it's timed around the beginning of March, and as you can imagine with the timing of being the end of winter and the start of spring, it's a period which symbolizes rebirth and renewal, as life essentially starts up again with the end of a hard winter. When you finish Jinhsi's story, One of the cutscenes that will play as Hongzhen is unfrozen is a storyteller describing Jinhsi's life and what Hu and she had basically gone through in the story quest. At the end, the storyteller also includes a small rhyme, which is as follows.
When thunder roars in spring's embrace, the sun shall shine upon this place. For only through death and strife can one truly embrace new life.
As you can probably tell by now, this rhyme is a direct reference to the Chinese Jingzhe, which, as we discussed before, is symbolic of birth and renewal. When thunder roars in spring's embrace is a parallel to the spring thunder of the Jingzhe, which awakens insects. The sun shining on this place symbolizes the beginning of spring, and the last two lines about life and death are direct references to the period of the Jingzhe, being between the death of winter and the hope of spring. If you've watched my Vrlova video, you'll know, but Kuro has a sort of interesting, almost fascination with purgatorial concepts of basically treading the line between life and death, and it's really interesting that even with Jinhsi's story you see a little bit of that come out. Anyway, if you remember the English name of Jinhsi's quest, the Four of Eons, it also makes sense since the Jingzhe begins when the winter ends, which essentially translates into meaning the Four of Winter. The name of Jinhsi's gacha banner, Four-Born Renewal, follows the exact same principle of the Jingzhe. This, of course, opens up a whole world of potential symbolisms, because not only is Mount Firmament as a map inspired by wintry themes, but winter itself has long symbolized a time of despair and calamity in China. The whole concept of Jingzhe and the Four of Eons essentially encapsulates the fact that in a long march of despair that Jinzhou and Hongzhen have suffered at the hands of the lament, Jinhsi, as the new magistrate, as well as the present tide, as the name suggests, will bring the end to this disaster, heralding the beginning of not only hope, but that of a fortuitous spring. As a little piece of symbolism to accompany the discussions we've had in previous few chapters, it's appropriate to talk about the release of Jinhsi's Peach Blossom skin a few months after a banner, where we got another little treasure trove of symbolism that came alongside it. The whole concept of the peach blossom as a flower that blooms in the early spring is in itself completely iconic of the Jingzhe that we already talked about, as well as a direct reference to the poem Tao Yao, or Peach Blossom, from the Shijing, an anthology of poems from the 7th to 11th century BC of China. In the poem, which I will just post on the screen real quick when I get around to editing this, we can see that the concepts of spring's renewal and the Jingzhe is iconic. In addition to this, the young lady who makes a bower from the shade of the peach tree in the poem is a direct parallel to Jinhsi's responsibility in carving a new peace and future for Jingzhou, managing it well day and night. When we link this idea to Jinhsi's skin in its own trailer, we see that this idea doesn't just resonate with the previous points of symbolism we talked about, but also the Tao Yao poem perfectly. Jinhsi's own skin, called Brilliant Peach Blossom, is a direct quote from the poem's second line, which can also be translated into English as meaning brilliant are its flowers. The whole theme of the skin being peach blossoms, or Tao Yao, is also paralleled in a song that plays in her skin trailer, which I'll quickly pull up as well. Across the waves the arbiter comes to guide, with a single strike she calls forth spring's tide. Thus life begins anew and frost gives way. A spring breeze warms the jade gate display. Now the blooms blush and the willows sway, perhaps my spring too will come today. As we can see, the symbolism of spring as a time of renewal and hope with the Jingzhe is demonstrated quite clearly with the theme of the peach blossom, which in itself is a flower that blooms in early spring. With the theme of falling, whether it be that of ice and time, running through the entirety of Jinhsi's symbolism, it's no wonder that her skin took on the theme of the peach blossom. As her signature weapon, I think, says best, The sword embodies all things, uniting them into one. Its gentle aura seems capable of dissolving the indestructible, whether it's the millennia-old ice or the stagnation of time. Now that we've covered through the concept of Jingzhe and the beginning of spring, now is actually a pretty good time to talk about a poem called Spring View, written in 757 AD, especially since it was during the violence and the destruction of the Anlushan rebellion happening during that time. Because understanding Jingzhe by itself is not entirely the full picture. If we look at, for example, the scene of Jinzhe's Resonator Showcase,
Are you still with me? Our Central Secretariat has ratified your succession. This ceremony with Sentinel Jue will be the final step.
Understood. I'll mend our city's scars from battle beneath the crescent.
I know you will. But remember, you have a long way to go. Now, stay focused and walk ahead with confidence.
we can see that this line is a direct reference to Du Fu's poem Spring View. In the first two lines, he mirrors and echoes essentially both what Jinhsi says and the symbolism of hope itself in the Jingzhe. The state is destroyed, mountains and rivers remain. In the city in spring, grass and trees grow deep. Essentially, what we didn't really cover fully in the previous section on the Jingzhe is the cost of war, or the cost of winter, of the incessant destruction that has been wrought on by the laments. Du Fu's poem, as we said before, was written during a time of war, and it echoes the hope of restoration and rebuilding with the metaphor of the spring and the Jingzhe. As life continues despite the devastation, Jinhsi begins the arduous task of restoration, making sure that grass and trees grow deep, in order to safeguard the present and herald the future. When I was rewatching the conversation that Jue and Yu have with Jinhsi in the Huanglong chamber, one particular line caught my attention, especially as we already discussed the importance of War and Tide, with both the symbolism of Dragon Kings and Jinhsi's name itself, the present tide. It is as follows: "The waning waves ebb and flow. They shall send you back to where you belong." As often is the case, I'm going to be taking a little bit of creative liberty here, and I'm going to say that this specific line is actually related to another line in a poem called Seeing Meng Haoran for Guiling at Yellow Crane Tower, written by Li Bai around 700 AD. As the title suggests, the poem is about the poet seeing off his friend from the Yellow Crane Tower, watching as his boat gets smaller and smaller, sailing off into the horizon. You can see it pretty clearly in the poem itself, which is rather short. "You left me, old friend of the West, at the Yellow Crane Tower. In spring, going to Yangzhou, in a crowd of flowers, your lonely sail a speck against the blue sky, disappearing, until now I only see the Yangtze and the sky." There's two things that we really need to break down here. First off, the Yellow Crane Tower isn't just a work of fantasy, but an actual place you can still visit in China, even nearly 2,000 years later. It's called the Yellow Crane Tower because the roof is shaped like a flying crane, which symbolizes immortality and wisdom, which is something we can relate to stuff we already covered on Dragon Kings and Jue, who is, essentially, immortality and wisdom incarnates. The second thing is the actual river itself. Li Bai uses the Yangtze River as a sort of metaphor to describe the continuity of life. Just like how the river never stops flowing, life moves on and on. This is really important because if you remember, all the way at the beginning of all of this yapping, I told you to remember the meaning of Jinhsi's name because it would be important later. Well, this is the time. Just like how Li Bai, in his poem, uses a flow of the river to communicate the unstoppable nature of life and time, Jinhsi's name, which means present tide, suggests that she will deal with the ebb and flow of the dark tide as it comes, safeguarding a place in the present, even as a river of life keeps flowing. As with Shorekeeper, who mentions that the waves will always bring Rover back to black shores, Zhiwei says the same thing.
The wuthering waves ebb and flow. They shall send you back to where you belong.
During the mission where you are going into Mianlong Chamber to communicate with Zhiwei, the surface of the tank where Zhiwei resides and swims shows a very distinct pattern, which I think is a direct parallel with the 8 trigrams of the I-Ching. The I-Ching is a sort of divination method used since ancient times in China, almost like the tarot cards that we talked about in the Cardafia video. The I-Ching is composed of Bagua, or in English, the 8 trigrams. Each trigram has a certain compass direction and a sort of element associated with them. This is then divided into 58 hexagrams, which symbolize a sort of progression through the cycles of life, similar to how the tarot explores the journey of the fool to self-betterments. While this will be a sort of leap of faith in terms of creative liberty, even for me, I think that all of Jinhsi's resonance chain actually sort of tells a story of her and a story quest, and each single piece of a resonance chain can actually be linked to an I-Ching hexagram. For instance, her first resonance chain, Abyssal Ascension, isn't really well translated into English. In Chinese, it is 澄海灰天素, which translates to mean something along the lines of return from the abyss of the ocean to reach for heaven. This links to hexagram 29 of the I-Ching, which is comprised of 2 water trigrams and is symbolic of the abyss and trouble. You can see, for example, that within Jinhsi's 3rd cherished item, the Lung Scale, she is rescued by Zhiwei while drowning in a dream, which is a metaphor for how her journey begins, once she is revived from death by Zhiwei. The second resonance chain, Chronofrost Repose, is also a very poor translation. In Chinese, it is 融雪凝平息, which sort of means a soft snow that is beginning to form and compact. Essentially, I think this forms the beginning of the snowstorm when the Dragon King goes into the Mianlong Chamber to rest. This can be attributed to hexagram 52, which is composed of 2 mountain trigrams, Mount Firmament, you know what I mean, and symbolizes a state of stillness and rest, a moment to recharge one's energy. The third resonance chain, Celestial Incarnate, is actually not such a bad translation, so we'll kind of stick with that. This part of the resonance chain symbolizes Jinhsi's role as a Sentinel's resonator of the bridge between heaven and earth, like Huangdi, which we mentioned earlier. This is a parallel to the part of the story quest when Yu and Jinhsi first access the Mianlong Chamber and see Zhiwei for the first time, and it is represented by hexagram 1, which represents the divine or heaven. The fourth resonance chain, Benevolent Grace, is also a decent translation as well, so we'll go with it. Essentially, if you've been following, you can probably guess that this represents the part of the story where Jinhsi essentially shows her benevolence, going as far as to risk herself to a fate worse than death, just for a chance that Zhiwei can survive and Jingzhe can be saved. This links to hexagram 42, which is composed of the trigrams Wind over Thunder, that symbolizes collective benefits, where the personal sacrifice of one person can result in a collective benefit of the many in Jingzhe and Hongzhen. The fifth chain, Frostfire Illumination, is a pretty bad translation, so we'll go through the Chinese version again. In Chinese, Jinhsi's fifth chain is called Liuguang Hua Shangshe, which translates about somewhat to flowing light melts the frosted snow. Essentially, this symbolizes the fight between Jinhsi and Jue as they begin to metaphorically melt the ice that has trapped both Hongzhen and Jue. This links to hexagram 30, which is made up of 2 fire trigrams, symbolizing transformation, change, and purification through the imagery of fire. With the concept of the Jingzhe that we already covered, this essentially symbolizes that winter is nearly ending and that hope is close. The final and 6th chain, Falling Triumph, is good, but it doesn't really fully capture the meaning of the Chinese version. In Chinese, Jinsi's final resonance chain, called Hanjing You Fengchun, translates quite simply to winter ends and spring arrives. I think if you've been listening to previous parts, you know exactly what this means by now. The final resonance chain fully encapsulates the symbolism of the Jingzhe and the peach blossoms that we already described. It basically represents the end of her story, when she finishes a fight with Jue and takes in the temporal mandate, averting crisis and providing hope. This can be linked with hexagram 24, which is made up of the trigrams Earth over Thunder, which also matches perfectly with what we already covered in the Jingzhe. The Jingzhe is begun with the springtime thunder, which roars across the earth, awakening the insects to herald spring. Hexagram 24 also symbolizes the return of light after the winter solstice, of restoration and renewal after hardship. And with this, the entire story arc is complete, told entirely within even her resonance chain. In spite of the surge of winter and despair, Jinsi's altruism brings a light that peeks through clouds and brings the hope of spring.
I still remember the day the ice began to melt. Without you, hope might still be lost. Now that spring returns, who will share it with me? The peach blossom's beauty longs for ice that see.
Government must be guided by virtue. Chi, do you keep this in mind?
Yes, virtue must come first. Politics, commerce, it all must serve the people.
From now on, you shall be known as Jinhsi, bearing Jingzhe's name as your own.